So, Roman numeral 3 in our lecture series on American history, the Washington administration, 1789 to 1797. What you're going to notice is this is a two-term president. So as we start to go through this course and we start to go through the presidents, some are two terms, which means they had a successful first term. And then when we get to the second term, we'll find that there's a disturbing trend for second-term presidents. They have a pretty bad second term. And so let's go through this. So obviously George Washington is our first president, and that's why he gets elected in 1789. So let's go to the next slide. So one of the things you need to know about Washington's administration is since he's the first president, he's going to create a lot of traditions, right? He's going to set a lot of precedents for future presidents to follow because he's the first one, and so whatever he does is going to be what future presidents will follow, and it'll just become our history and part of our tradition. And so George Washington is, like I said, our first president. He's the only president that's ever been unanimously elected by the Electoral College. And he's also the only president without a political party. Political parties did not yet exist in America because it's a brand new country under a new constitution. But during his presidency, we will see two political parties will grow. And so that's a new precedent or tradition that's going to be established. Now, George Washington, as we're going to find out, does not like political parties. He thinks they're divisive and not helpful for the United States' future. But they're going to develop under him nonetheless. Here he is taking his oath of office in New York. So one of the first things that the president does is he realizes that the executive branch is way too big of a responsibility for just one man. And so he is going to create what we today call a cabinet. The cabinet is originally composed of three cabinet departments. They are the departments of state, Treasury, and War. And so these are all going to help the president do what he sees as his most important job. So let's talk about this. So the first Secretary of State, the person in charge of the State Department, is going to be Thomas Jefferson, a fellow Virginian, just like George Washington, who has been in France. And so he has some experience dealing with other countries, and that's what the Secretary of State does. They help the president determine our foreign policy, how we should deal with the rest of the world. Then we have a good friend of Washington's, Alexander Hamilton, and here he is on the bottom right. He's going to be the Secretary of the Treasury, and it's his job to make sure that the health and well-being of the government financially is in good hands. And also, Hamilton believes that he's going to use the office also to increase America's economic growth overall, not just in the public sector, the government, but also in the private sector. And then we have Henry Knox, who is the Secretary of War. Obviously, it's his job to make sure our military is ready to go and to defend the country. Now, one of the first things that Congress does under George Washington's presidency is they pass the Bill of Rights. So if you remember during the ratification debate, especially in Massachusetts, the supporters of the Constitution said that we will pass 10 amendments or changes to the Constitution that will give us a Bill of Rights, that will protect our civil liberties. And so we have this brand new Constitution, and immediately it's changed 10 times. But this collective 10 amendments are known as the Bill of Rights. And these are the ones that the first amendment is what a lot of people really know, right? It gives the right to protect you from you have the right of freedom of speech and press, the right to assemble, the right to petition the government for change. These are the rights people immediately think of when they think of the Bill of Rights. And so these are all kind of limits or handcuffs on the federal government, saying that these are the things that the government cannot do to you. It is limiting the government. And so this is a very Enlightenment idea that governments should be restrained and constricted because they can become oppressive and take over your rights. And so for the people who didn't like the new Constitution, the anti-federalists, this is something that the Federalists promised that they would put into the Constitution to make them happy and feel that their rights are protected. And so we see that, okay, so we have our 10 amendments, right? And so, you can go through them. You certainly should in a government course. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. Third Amendment is government can't quarter troops in your home. Search and seizure is the Fourth Amendment, so forth and so on, right? The Ninth Amendment says that these are not your only rights. That even though we've listed in the previous 8 amendments rights that you have, we don't want this is not an all-inclusive list. And so the states can also guarantee people's rights. And so that's the Ninth Amendment. And then the 10th Amendment, it says that it's really a nod to those people who believed in states' rights, who believed that they yearn for the days of the Articles of Confederation. They want the federal government to be weak and the states to have more power. Because they think that the only way to have true democracy is to have it as close to the people as possible. If you have states having power, well, they're close to the people. I mean, physically close to the people. It's not that hard to go visit your state capital, and you can run for your state office, and you can talk to your state representatives because they're physically close to you. And so if the government is physically close to the people, then that means the people have control. If we have some far-off national government that's way in New York City at this point, eventually in Washington, D.C., well, you can't go there. It's very hard for a regular citizen to do that, and they can't visit their representatives, and they can't visit their president, and they can't make their voices heard. So the people who believed in states' rights, the people who believe that the state should have the most power, they think that the best way to guarantee democracy is to have a strong state government and a weak national government. And to make them happy, we passed the 10th Amendment, which says that, unless there are specific powers listed for the federal government, they're reserved for the states, which means the states have the power. So in the Constitution, we have these enumerated powers. It says the Congress have the power to raise taxes, and they have the power to create a currency, et cetera, and they're listed. But everything not listed, which you can imagine is a lot of things, those all the federal government can't do, and all of those other things are reserved to the states. And so here we see this great example of this debate in America still going on today, as it was then, and during the constitutional ratification process of who should have all the power in our federal system. Should the national government have the power or the state governments have the power? Well, of course, as we've said in our ratification lecture, that this 10th Amendment, which says all the power not given specifically to the federal government is reserved for the states, well, that is specifically in contrast to the Elastic Clause in the Constitution, which says that the Congress can make up new powers if they so choose that are necessary and proper. And so obviously we have some confusing territory here. Should we listen to Article 10 and give the states the power, or should we listen to the Elastic Clause and give the federal government the power? And the answer is unknown. We have been debating about that, like I said, from when the Constitution was written all the way up until this very present day. Right? So that's one of the first actions of Congress during the Washington administration. Another thing Congress does is they help to create the judicial branch. Now, in the Constitution, it says we're going to have a judicial branch. It says we're going to have a Supreme Court, and that's pretty much all it says about the judicial branch of government. It doesn't really say what their powers are. It doesn't really, for the most part, say how the court is going to be made up, how many justices are there. We don't know. It doesn't say. Even today, it still doesn't say the specific number of justices. Are there going to be lesser courts that will help the Supreme Court do their job? I don't know. And so the Judicial Act of 1799 kind of gives some bones to this third branch of government. It says that we're going to have a Supreme Court. The Constitution says that, but it says that we're going to have lesser courts, and this is what they're going to look like, and they're going to help the Supreme Court do their job, because there's just too many cases for one court to figure out. And so we have lesser courts that will decide, and if we want to appeal their decisions, we can raise it to a higher court, and eventually the Supreme Court of the land. And so we see these two very important precedents or traditions or ideas are set during the first administration of Washington. All right, next. So Hamilton's vision for America. So now let's go on to Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Alexander Hamilton. So Hamilton, he believes fervently, strongly, that America should be a pro-business country, that we're only going to be great if we can build up our cities, if we can build up some kind of an industry, because only then can America stand on its own 2 feet and not be economically dependent on England or France or Spain or some other power. And so he wants America to be great. He fought in the Revolution alongside George Washington, and so he has this dream, this vision that America will be this strong economic powerhouse, right? And the only way to make that happen, to have America be a strong economic powerhouse, is you've got to make the federal government even stronger than the Constitution originally said. Because only a strong national government can take the steps and actions necessary to promote business, right? And so we are going to see that he has twin goals. Make the economy strong, and to do that, make the federal government, the national government, strong. And so coalescing around him is going to be a group of people that feel the same way. And so we have this group of people called the Federalists Now, they typically tend to be the same people that were Federalists during the ratification debate, but not always. And the difference here is they're not a faction. They're not just there to get the Constitution ratified. This is a permanent political party with a whole agenda of things to get accomplished, not just the Constitution being ratified, but to get a strong government and to be very pro-business. And so this is our very first political party in American history. All right, and so here we see the twin goals of the federal government being strong and pro-business being strong. And really, if that's kind of the Federalist Party in a nutshell. And so let's talk about some of the things that Hamilton tries to do to get the federal government stronger. And so one of the things he does is he has this scheme, it's called the assumption of the debt at par. And so whose debt and what does par mean? And so as the United States government gets going, right, we have some states in the United States that are still in debt from the Revolution, and we have other states that are not in debt from the Revolution. For example, Virginia had raised its taxes on its people after the Revolution, and they had paid off its Revolutionary War debt. But other states like New York hadn't. And so we have some states who are still struggling to pay off their debt and some states that haven't. Well, what does this have to do with the federal government? And so what Hamilton says is this new federal government will assume or take on the state's debts that are still in debt. And so like if you're New York, the federal government will come knocking at your door and say, hey, New York, would you like us to just pay off all your Revolutionary War debts? And of course, if you're the governor of New York, you're like, yes, please. That would be like somebody coming to you today and saying, hey, I know you have a big Visa or MasterCard bill, so why don't you just let me pay it for you? And who wouldn't say yes to that? And so these states, all of these states that are still in debt are now out of debt, right? As long as the federal government keeps assuming their debts. Now, this is going to put this brand new federal government in debt, right? We've taken away the debts from the state government, but now the federal government, the national government, has taken over these debts. Why on earth would this brand new country do this? Well, it's because it's Hamilton's goals, right? He wants to make the federal government strong, and this is a way to do that, right? Why should the states do what the federal government says? Well, because we're paying your debt for you. And as long as we pay your debt for you, you're of course going to do what I say. Let's go back to the example of the credit card debt. If somebody knocks on your door and says, I'm going to pay your Visa card off, as long as you're my friend and as long as you do what I say. And so of course you're going to do whatever they say and be their friend because they're paying off your thousands of dollars in credit card bills. And so this is how it works, right? If the government assumes the state debts, then the states will do everything they can to make the federal government happy so they keep paying off their debt, hitting Hamilton's idea of a stronger national government, where the national government's on top and the states are subservient, right? And so this seems to go with his plan. It also says elite, because a lot of the elite people in America, they had loaned money to the states during the Revolution, and these states are having a tough time paying it back. And so if the government assumes the debt, then that's going to make the states happy, but also it's going to make the elite rich people of America happy because the government is honoring this debt. And of course, Hamilton wants the rich elite people to run America, and so he wants them to support his scheme. This assuming the debt at par means, it's accomplishing all kinds of things. It's making the state support the government and these rich people support the government. Now, at par just means at full value, not at a discount. We are going to honor whatever we say is owed at full value. Right. Now, so the state government, so we've talked about how it kind of creates support for the government. However, there is some states out there like Virginia that have said, oh, no, we don't like this for two reasons. One, we've already paid off our debt. So why should our new common federal government that we're all paying taxes to, why should we all pay taxes to that common federal government to pay off New York's debt? We in Virginia have already paid off our debt. Why should we pay for the people in New York to pay their debt? So we don't think we like this. Plus, Thomas Jefferson lives in Virginia, and Thomas Jefferson is a firm believer in state power, not national power. He believes the new national government, even though he's a part of it, he believes the new national government should be as weak as possible because Thomas Jefferson is a firm believer in democracy. He says that, democracy can only happen when the government is physically close to the people. So that's why the state should have the power, and they should not be underneath the national government. And so he also opposes this for those two reasons. But it eventually gets passed, and it gets passed because Hamilton works out a deal where he and Madison and Jefferson sit down together and they work out a deal that Thomas Jefferson will say, okay, we'll let you guys assume the estate, the assumption of the debt at par, but you have to put the national capital in near Virginia, in Washington, in this new place called Washington, D.C. And so both sides get something they want. The Federalists get a very strong, much stronger national government, which is what they want. And then Thomas Jefferson, the people that support his idea of states' rights and more democracy, they're going to create something called a new party called the Democratic Republican Party that's opposing the Federalists. And the only reason he can convince his party to say yes to this is because of this whole deal to get the national capital nearer to Virginia. And so we have these two now national parties forming, the Federalists, who we've already talked about, and the Democratic Republicans, who were headed by Madison and Jefferson and this guy named Aaron Burr. And they say that they believe in states' rights and less power to the federal government, more power to the states. And they want a country full of farmers, not business owners, because farmers they're their own bosses and nobody can control their vote. That's democracy. If we have a country full of cities and industry, well, then people's votes are going to be controlled by their bosses and the factory owners. And so that's not democracy. And so we have these two very different parties developing in America. All right, next issue that Hamilton is pushing. He wants a tariff. He wants the government to pass a tax on imports. Well, as we know by now, this new Constitution allows the government to pass taxes. And so Hamilton says, okay, the government is going to pass a tariff. Now, the reason he wants this is because he's very pro-business. And if you're an American businessman just getting started in this new country, you can't become successful because you have to compete with these British imports. Let's use the example of, I don't know, shoes, right? And so if you're an American shoe manufacturer, you're just getting started, well, you don't really know what you're doing because you're just getting started. And so you make mistakes, and so your shoes are kind of expensive. But the British, they've been doing the early parts of the Industrial Revolution for several years now, and so they just flood American markets with these cheap British shoes. And so if I'm a consumer in Virginia or Pennsylvania or New York, I'd much rather buy British-made shoes because they're cheaper than American-made shoes. And so if that continues, we talked about this during the Articles of Confederation, if that continues, then America will never develop her own industry. We will always just be weak and at the mercy of British industries. And so that is not Hamilton's vision. And so he wants the United States government to promote business. And so he proposes a tariff on all British imports, which is a tax, right? And so when in our example, shoe comes into American ports, you have the cost of the shoe and then an additional cost of a tax on the shoe that'll be so expensive that it'll force Americans to buy American-made goods. This is certainly going to help American manufacturers. And so this is business. This is pro-business. Yay, Hamilton and the Federals like, this is what we need to do. Plus, it's going to generate revenue for the federal government because the tariff is a tax, which will help us pay off the assumption of the debt at par. You see how this all kind of goes together, which will support Hamilton's scheme for a stronger national government. Of course, the Democratic Republicans do not like this, because it's going to make the federal government stronger, and they don't like paying taxes for the benefit of business owners, because remember, Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans want a farming America, not to promote business in America. And it also is going to hurt, it's also going to anger Jefferson and Madison and the people of the Democratic Republican Party, because a lot of them are Southerners, and they are farm. And so if we put a tax on British imports, well, the British are going to put a tariff on American tobacco to, punish us. And so if I'm a tobacco farmer, there's no way I want this to have this American tariff because the British will respond by their own tariff. And now I can't sell my tobacco to English people. And so that's going to hurt me as a businessman. And so this seems to be definitely benefiting the Federalist people, not the Democratic Republican people. And so Jefferson says, no, you can't do this. And so here's another issue that we see coalescing, that two parties are coalescing around, whether they support it or reject it. All right, next issue. Excise taxes. So an excise tax is a tax not on goods coming into America, but on goods made in America and sold in America. So it's an internal tax. And so one of the things that Hamilton proposes to tax is whiskey. He does this because, one, the federal government needs money to pay off the assumption of the debt at par, and also, perhaps maybe to stick it to Jefferson a little bit. You see, Hamilton supporters are pro-business people. They're not really farmers, and Jefferson supporters are farmers, and on the frontier, we don't really have a lot of roads yet. And so if I'm a farmer who wants to get his corn crop to market, it's really hard for me to get my corn crop to market because I gotta take all those ears of corn, put them in a wagon, and then take them, I don't know, 50, 100, 200 miles to some city of the east where it can be sold. And I said, we really don't have very good roads. And so this crop is way too bulky to get it to go to the East Coast. But there is a way to condense that crop of corn. You can distill it into whiskey, right? And then you take this huge wagon full of ears of corn and now put it into a much smaller wagon of whiskey bottles. And so it's lighter and it's easier to transport. And so whiskey becomes an important crop. Whiskey becomes an important item that farmers use to make money to, pay off their debts. It becomes so important that on the frontier, it even becomes a form of currency that people would barter and sell with jugs of whiskey. And so for people on the frontier, by taxing their whiskey, you're not only taxing something they like to drink, but you're taxing their currency. It's kind of like an income tax. And so it is disproportionately affecting Jefferson supporters who are farmers by and large. And so he certainly does not support this tax. One, because it's hurting his supporters, and two, because it's going to let the federal government get bigger and stronger and wealthier. Right? And so we see that farmers in Pennsylvania launch a rebellion against this tax. It's called the Whiskey Rebellion. And so they say, look, we fought a revolution so we wouldn't have some far-off government taxing us into debt. And so they're like, no more, right? And so they rise up and start rising up against the government in Pennsylvania. Well, Pennsylvania sends a letter to President Washington and like, you have to put this down. And so President Washington says, of course I can, right? Because this is a new, stronger constitution that has money, that can raise an army. And so Washington puts on his old army outfit. He gets some people to go ahead of him, and then he is going to lead the army later to put down this rebellion. Well, before the army even gets to Pennsylvania, the farmers learn, oh shoot, the government is strong now. They can actually put this down. And so they flee away. And so the rebellion is put down. And this is a great example of how the government has changed. It's a great change over time, right? Because during Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government could not do anything to put this down. They didn't have any money or a significant army to put it down. But here, under the Constitution, boom, we can put it down just like that. So this shows you how much the government is stronger under this new Constitution as opposed to the Articles of Confederation. All right, now let's go to the National Bank. And so the National Bank is a privately owned bank. So let's start there, right? This is going to be, even though it says national, it's a privately owned bank by some of the richest men in America, right? And so, okay, so we have this bank. Now, banks make money by people putting money in the bank, and then the bank loans out that money to other people with interest. And the bank makes money off of the interest. Now, Hamilton believes fervently that we need a really big bank. Now, there are banks in America, but they're not very big yet. He believes that we need a really big bank with lots of money in it, because if we're going to have industry, like this shipbuilding company here, well, we're going to have a really big bank so that people who want to make their businesses big can actually go and get really sizable loans, big loans, to start really building up American industry. And at the current time, all the banks we have right now are too small, right? They just don't have enough money. And so he says that he goes to some really big, powerful, rich men, and he says, I want you to create a national bank. They're like, well, that's great. We could create a bank, but we wouldn't have near enough money to finance some of these big businesses you're proposing. And he says, don't worry about it. The United States government, the federal government, will be the main depositor in your bank. In other words, all of this money that we're collecting from taxes, whether from the whiskey tax or the tariff, all of that money is going to go to the federal government. And then instead of just sitting on it, the government is going to redirect that money to the national bank. And so the government is going to put millions and millions of dollars, right, in the bank for quote-unquote safekeeping, right? So now what is this? And so here's an example of a rich guy, right, who is an investor in the bank, right? And so all of a sudden this rich guy who owns the bank Great. He's going to become successful because the national government is putting money in his bank, and then he's going to use that money to loan out to other businessmen who want to start like this shipbuilding business. And so great, it's really going to be kind of priming the pump here. It's going to be helping, being a stimulus that really get big business in America going. And so this is great. This helps Hamilton's vision. Now, of course, Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans hate this plan. One, because it's going to promote business in America, and they want America to be a nation of farmers, not businesses, which we talked about before. And two, who is paying for this? The poor farmer, right? He is paying taxes that is going to go indirectly directly to the federal government and then indirectly to rich businessmen to help the rich get richer, to build their businesses up. And he's like, no, that's going to create income inequality in America, and it's going to help the rich people get even more powerful and more in charge of America. No, says Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. No, we want America to be controlled by the common man farmer. So no, they oppose this, right? It passes anyway. And so let's now take a look at the key concepts that we should really take away from this. One, describe the various government institutions and precedents that were created in the Washington administration. Well, we had talked about him creating a cabinet. We had talked about, during his administration, Congress creating the Judiciary Act that sets up this judicial branch, and they also passed the Bill of Rights that's going to become a hallmark of the United States government, and what we mean as and live by as Americans. And so that's what we're talking about there, right? Two, then it says, describe the various positions on economic policy and state versus federal power that led to the first political parties. And so we talked about Hamilton and his Federalists believing in pro-business and pro-big national government. And so we talked about them assuming the debt at par. We talked about them creating a national bank. And these are all things to meet Hamilton's goals. And then we also talked about the Jeffersonians who said, no, we believe in a smaller government, so we're opposed to these schemes. We want power to the people, so we want states' rights, not federal power, and we want a nation of farmers that can't have their votes controlled by some business class. And so we see that we had the Democratic Republicans being created. And so during Washington's presidency, we're seeing, which is another kind of tradition of America, this kind of two-party system being created during his administration. All right, so when we come back in part two, we'll talk about Washington's foreign policies.